All right. Good morning. Good morning. Special edition of Word on the Street Wednesday this morning. We are going to do a brief, probably maybe half the session, coverage of GAR contract disclosures, lead-based paint edition, where we're going to go deep into some of the new lead-based paint forms that are out there and what you should do with them. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen here. Da-da. There we go. How's that? Everybody with me?
Yes,
Excellent. Thank you for the feedback, Robin. I appreciate the conversation. Um,
happy to help.
all right. I'm still admitting people here as they come in. All good. All right. So we're going to talk about lead-based paint disclosures. I sure start an AI companion. Have at it. Um, but I need my participants still. There we go. Okay, so this, as we've talked about in our weekly GAR class, is the lead-based paint disclosure or the exhibit, right? This is the piece that you attach to your purchase and sale agreements. You have your sellers fill out, all that good stuff. And in the past, that was pretty much it, right? This and the brochure, that was really all you did, right? Yes, no, maybe so. Adam, are you asleep? Okay. Um,
Yes.
excellent.
I
Thank
will
you.
say yes for you, Brett.
Thanks, Marcy.
Correct.
All right. This is the new F318. At least it's new to me. I'm pretty sure it's new as a form in general, but we'll go with that. This is the seller's brokers, so listing agents, notice to seller of seller's obligations regarding lead-based paint. Now, let's just ask the straight up question. This document clearly states that, hey, seller, you're responsible if the building was built prior, property was built prior to 1978, you must disclose the buyer to the buyer presence of known lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards, provide the buyer with all available records, reports or pertaining to lead-based paint, provide the buyer with a lead-based paint hazard information pamphlet, which we are familiar with, and permit them to have a 10-day period to conduct a risk assessment. And then you, as the listing broker, listing agent, sign it, put the information on there, and off you go. Why would you do this? When would you do this form?
On the FISBO.
A for sale by owner, sure. But are you the seller's broker on a FISBO?
No.
Not necessarily. I mean, you could become one, but
I
so
think we sign
let's
this with a listing agreement.
you say that again, Adam.
You sign this when they're signing the listing agreement along with
Agreed.
all.
Yep.
Yeah,
So
but this is only signed by the agent.
this is only signed by the agent, but it's provided to the seller during the listing agreement presentation process, right? Like as they're signing listing paperwork, if their property was built prior to 1978, you should sign this, date it, and give it to them. Even though you're going to have them fill out a lead-based paint exhibit and you're going to give them the information packet, right? But you need to sign this and give it to them, showing that you have fulfilled the obligation of notifying them of their responsibilities. Make sense?
It
And
will.
Seems redundant.
Once you go back to the lead-based paint exhibit, Brett, it'll make sense.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, because the lead-based paint exhibit says that you've notified them of their obligation, right? Remember that new language in the lead-based paint exhibit that we talked about?
Mhm.
So that is what this is tied to. Okay, so this is your
Okay.
official notification to the seller as their agent of their requirements or responsibilities, I should say, as a seller of a property built prior to 1978. Now, what
Well,
if I list a house that was built in 2020? Do I need to do this?
No,
Should you do this?
no.
I'd say no. I really only think we should do this if the property was built prior to 1978. Christy, do you agree with that?
I mean, we do 79 just in case there was some overage from a build in
Sure, sure.
78. We're a little funny about the year 78, so we do 79 and older.
Gotcha. I don't disagree with that. Because I'm sure somebody had a storehouse of paint in 1978 that they painted houses with for a year or two afterwards, right? So, definitely good. All right, so
So
that's
Brett,
go
hey,
ahead.
Frank. So when I send a listing agreement, I check off the lead-based paint and I include it in I typically do e-sign. So
Mhm.
this just seems redundant since it's
It
already
is
covered.
redundant.
It is
And have
redundant.
you ever heard the phrase CYA?
Yeah,
That's
I just tell the sellers I have to have this before we can list the property. That's
but
pretty
part
much
of
it.
and we're going to get to another form in a minute that Chris Jinko was pointing out to us. But part of the issue is that you're not, by just providing them with the exhibit, you're not really spelling out in clear language what their responsibilities are, right? That form is a legal form. It's a little confusing if you don't really understand what it's trying to get you to do. And this form is designed to just say, seller, you must do these things, and here they are.
Greg, can you show the lead paint exhibit again?
Mm-hmm. Maybe. I only have the first portion of it. I don't have the rest of it. Um,
Right.
so, but I mean,
But
it does
in those
say
top
here,
sections, does it cover those 3 or 4 bullet points from the other form?
it
I
in
mean, to Dan's
theory,
point,
in theory, this form does cover kind of everything that it needs to say. And for example, it says up here that they have to give the lead-based paint brochure prior to the buyer and seller entering into a binding agreement. It says that, you understand your responsibilities and the 10-day and all those sorts of things. But again, look at the simplicity of this form compared to this form. Does that make sense?
I personally think, Brett, that form was created sort of as a pair for the other form that you're about to talk about, which is actually more pertinent and which I say I will see practically no one using. And I have been wondering about that for the last
And,
4.5,
and
5 months. This is not new.
that is why,
This was taught in the class in December.
yeah. Well, it was as of the first of the year, right? These are new for
Right.
the 2025 contracts. So that is why we're having this special session to make
Yeah.
sure that everybody has this information. So yes, let's jump ahead to the buyer's broker obligation, because this is you as a buyer's agent. You are required to provide notice to the seller. Now, if the property's listed, how do you provide notice to the seller?
With
The
this
listing
new
agent.
form,
With this form, and who do you send it to?
the listing agent.
Listing agent, right? Because notice to the agent is notice to the client. And so all you have to do is fill in the address, put in the information, the buyer's broker information, and then sign it and send this to the listing agent. Now, you want to do that with your offer so that you are providing that notice to the seller. And then on the lead-based paint exhibit, which I will try to bring up here in a second, we can look at that section. But basically, if you remember, there's 2 slots there that says listing agent has notified the seller and initials there. And then there's a buyer's agent has notified the seller and there's initials there. On every transaction that on a property built prior to 1979, per Christie's comment, which I think is probably the safe way to go, you should have both of these forms if you're the listing agent in your file, because as the listing agent, you've given it to them. And then in theory, the buyer's agent is going to have included one with the contract. Now, we all know that most agents are not going to do this. As Marcy pointed out, it's not happening. But you, as better agents, need to include this buyer's broker notice to the seller with your offer. Go ahead, Robin.
Does anyone understand why, as a buyer's agent, I am obligated to notify the seller of their responsibility? I'm just, I'm just saying. And
I'm going to make it real simple because the EPA decided that they wanted it done that way.
Because Dad
alrighty
said
then.
so.
I mean,
there's no sense around it. It was created
no.
by the EPA and their guidelines. So I understand where
Is
where
this
y'all are
this
coming from.
is this the same EPA that's deciding it's okay if there's whatever crap in our water and all that kind of
Yes.
stuff?
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
But this is where they're going to focus.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Oh no, I agree. I think it's redundant as well, and I don't necessarily want to fill out extra forms, but
Yeah,
you know.
here we
Um,
are.
two things, Brett. One, Robin, those are healthy amoebas being reintroduced into the water supply.
Right.
It's about gut health.
Thank you.
Number two, that second box, is that still say if the seller is compensating the buyer's agent
Right.
to include this?
It
Right.
is.
No,
This regardless, or we just
no,
covering
no,
everything
no.
regardless?
On the, well, Brett, he doesn't have the full form. On the second page of the lead paint exhibit, where the initials go at the top,
Mhm.
I can maybe pull one up, but
I'll
where,
pull that up in a minute. So let's
okay, where
hold
the
on that
buyers,
conversation. I'll
where the
pull that up at
buyer's
the end.
agent, where the buyer's agent initials, if you initial, and this is, I think, the problem, and from the train the trainer class that I was on with Brett back in
Mhm.
December, in last year in January 2024, I think it was, when they added the place for the buyer's agent to initial. And we became of the opinion that buyer's agents don't, it was silly for buyer's agents to initial that because we had no way to notify sellers of that. And some buyer's agents were and continue to initial that, but don't use this notification form. So it doesn't make sense to put your initials on the exhibit if you haven't sent this notification.
Correct. And so we'll look at that part of the form in a second, but know that this, if you're submitting an offer on a property that was built prior to 1979, you should be including this form with your signature on it in the offer. Because that offer is going to go to the seller, and now that seller can read this and make sure they understand what their obligations are. Does that make sense?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why do you think they didn't put an exhibit spot on it so that you could?
Because you don't have to put this as part of the contract. In fact, it's really just, it's a notice, right? So it's not really part of the contract, but you would include it with the contract when you send it over. You don't have to make an exhibit to the contract. It's literally just a notice that you would send. You could, in theory, send this over when you're putting your offer together before you've sent the offer. You can send this ahead of time. You just have to have sent it prior to the contract becoming binding. That makes sense.
So if a seller properly executes a lead-based paint exhibit and has it available to include with your offer, is this really necessary again?
Yes.
Mhm.
All right.
Yeah. We're double dipping just to make sure we're fully coded.
Yeah. So what's that penalty from the EPA?
Yeah, I don't even want to know. It's,
Okay.
it's a
That's what it's
five-figure, it's not cheap, right? So it's not worth even risking. I'd spend the extra 30 seconds filling out this form to avoid any potential issues personally. Now, let's get to the fun.
Brett, it does say next to the initial part, what someone I think was asking in parentheses, it says only required if the buyer's agent receives
I know.
compensation
We're
from the
gonna
seller.
talk about that in a second. I'm gonna pull it up. But let's get over this. This is form F319. And it is legitimately the legal code from, you know, the law regarding lead-based paint disclosures. And you can provide this to, and you go through, this is literally just an excerpt from the situation. It talks about monetary penalties, and the actions and the civil liabilities and the costs and all that stuff. So this is Form F319. I would guess, I'm not going to ask because I don't want a record of it, but I would guess most of you have never seen this form. Um, this is a form that's actually been around for a while, and it is a great way to provide complete disclosure of obligations to a seller so that they fully understand. Now, I've had agents that used to provide this, and then I've had agents now that are like, well, wait, do I provide the 317 and this or just the 317? You know my thoughts on disclosure, right? There's no such thing as over disclosing. There just isn't. And so if I were doing a listing at this point on a property built prior to 1979, I would include the 317 as the listing agent. I would include the 319, which is this form. I would include the lead-based paint exhibit, and I would include the lead-based pamphlet to make sure that the seller has complete information and understands every aspect of their requirements. And I get it, Robin. I know it's a lot. At minimum, you need to be giving them the 317.
Mhm.
And then obviously they need to fill out an exhibit. But I personally think, especially if you're dealing with any kind of analytical type attorney slash engineer slash whatever, I don't think it hurts to give them this form, if that makes sense. All right. So let's go. Let me get out of this. Stop my share for a second. And let me pull up the actual form so we can look at that one spot, because that is an important piece that I missed when I was throwing these slides together before I had my monster drink this morning, clearly. I understand that this is a little bit tedious, but would you rather have a little tedious, or would you rather have a fine?
I think I'd rather have the fine so that we can take this to court and make the EPA answer for what they have done, Brett. That's what I think. Maybe I want that fight.
Okay, Adam, can we get
Plant
Ben
the flag.
off of our team here? We're going to be moving his license to another brokerage.
Yeah, this is being recorded, by the way.
Legitimate, I would say. I have no desire to fight the EPA currently. All right, so if we see here, everybody can see this live form?
Mhm.
Awesome. All right, so we'll go further than what I had on the first page. So buyer has to initial that they've received copies of the information and received the pamphlet, right? Makes sense. They get to initial here or here, whether they're waiving or receiving the 10 days. I don't know why you would waive the 10 days. As a buyer's agent, this is one of the things that I think people miss is if you just initial the first top layer, doesn't matter how long your due diligence is or anything like that, you have 10 days to get a risk assessment for the presence of lead-based paint.
But Brett, here's I think where the issue is on that, and I think I've heard Seth talk about this, because it says prior to the buyer being obligated under the purchase and sale agreement. So that buyer gets 10 days before they're even obligated under any other terms of the purchase and sale agreement. Whereas the next one says they're waiving the opportunity, but they can still get that done during their due diligence period.
Yeah.
And I think that's why most people, you would waive that 10-day, because what seller is going to agree to let you have 10 days to do this before anything else, any other obligation occurs.
That's a good point, Robin. I thought of that. I think the other thing is no one actually does lead paint testing.
I've seen
How often
people
do
it.
you see that?
I've
I've
seen
had-
people do it.
I've had just a couple of people.
Just a
Yeah,
couple.
not
So that's a
everybody.
pretty small percentage. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Isn't it just aren't we acknowledging by it being built in 1978 that they made a form, that they did all of this? Isn't it just suggestible that there's lead in the house somewhere at this
Yes.
point? Like, isn't it a given?
Yes.
It's a very, very high probability. Yes.
I just tell buyers to don't gnaw on the windowsill. That's it. Just don't do that.
I mean, the worst
And then
case is when you
wait
cut
10 years.
into it actually, and it creates dust out of it. That's where it becomes an issue.
Well-
All right, let's look at this agent acknowledgement piece. This is the piece that we've been talking about today based on those two forms. F here, which is the seller's agent, has informed the seller, is referenced when you initial this, you need to have given them the F317. Okay. As the buyer's agent, when you initial this, you need to have given the listing agent or the seller of a for sale by owner the F318. Okay. In my
Shouldn't this
opinion,
reference that?
say that again.
Shouldn't F and G reference that since they're so thorough?
Well, they're not that thorough, Dan. Come on. Yes, it should,
I understand.
but it doesn't. And then part of the thing that people have gotten hung up on is this phrase only required if the buyer's agent receives compensation from the seller. At the time of submitting the offer, where you're signing this in the acknowledgement, do you know for sure if the seller is compensating you or not as the buyer's broker? So again, in
A
the
lot of times
realm
you do.
of disclose,
Mhm.
why wouldn't you just do this to make sure that you're covered? And, in theory, what we're seeing still is that 90+% of the transactions that are coming through, the seller's compensating the buyer's broker in some way, shape, or form. So I would personally, again, as a buyer's agent, I would just initial this and, of course, send the 318. Any questions about
Yeah,
that?
Brett, I would say what I see is most of the time, I mean, whether it's our listing or our buyer, I see initials on G.
Yep.
I do not see of course, if it's our listing, well, if it's our listing, the other agent should be sending over also the 318 if they initial that. I
Correct.
think I've maybe only seen that once with someone it's our listing. I personally know who the buyer's agent is and have known that agent for 25 or 30 years and know that they're a very good agent. So, I mean, I think there are varying opinions, obviously, on this. Last year, when this section G came in and we didn't have the 318, I
Correct.
think our opinion was kind of like, well, don't initial that because you haven't given the information.
Right.
You haven't disclosed it. How would you disclose it? They're not your client. The other thing is, Brett, above F and G in the parentheses that you're pointing to. Whoops, no,
Oh, yeah, right here.
no. Where it says agent acknowledgement in bold, it says agent who informed seller of seller's obligations should initial. Therefore, I think also if you haven't sent the 318, you shouldn't initial G.
Agreed.
But it is, I mean, I agree with Brett that for CYA, it's better to do both.
Yes.
But if you initial that and you haven't sent the 318, you're
Then
initialing
you're-
something that you haven't done.
Correct.
And that is what 95 to 99% of the contracts right now are showing.
And that's why we're having this session to make
Yeah.
sure that you
Good.
guys, as better agents, know that you need to be sending the 318 with any offer on any property built prior to 1979. Any other questions about lead-based paint before we move on to our Word on the Street Wednesday combo. Pretty straight. I mean, pretty straightforward, pretty redundant, but very good CYA, which is the whole point of disclosures, right? Like we did a whole session a couple of weeks ago on disclosures. And so if you missed that, check that out on the YouTube channel, because obviously disclosing is, I mean, of my 20 years in the business, the majority of lawsuits that I've seen have been related to faulty disclosures or failure to disclose properly. So you want to make sure disclosures are done right. And that's why we spent the time to do this extra session. So, all right. Thank you guys for that. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to stop recording because we're just going to chat.